I'm John Buchanan, and in this video we're going to have a look at the Match EQ plugin. Now this is a really interesting tonal analysis tool. What it allows you to do is to take an audio file or a source file of any description and use that as a footprint for the sort of tonal shaping of another sound. In other words, I can ask Match EQ to analyze the frequency of one sound and then apply it to another. What we're going to do in this project is to take a whole mix and apply its frequency footprint to the mix of another track to make a really extreme case for how Match EQ can do some really interesting things. So firstly, let's just listen to the source track we're going to apply Match EQ to. Now this is one of the live loop sessions that I've just turned into a Logic project, and you can hear that it's got quite a sort of lo-fi, warm, not very hi-fi kind of sound. It's not very bright, it's not very fizzy, it's all quite contained and a little bit muddy, and deliberately so. Okay, now let's have a listen to a track that we know well. This is a mix of another live loops project, which is a much brighter, shinier track. Okay, so a completely different tonal character. Now, a couple of things to say. There's obviously a big volume difference between the kind of rendered, mastered mix of this track. You can see its waveform is really strong and full, and that's because it's been bounced down with some heavy limiting. And obviously, the other track is much less strong from a dynamics point of view. The first thing about Match EQ is it's not interested in dynamics. So it's not going to apply a dynamics change to your track. You're not going to suddenly find that your track gets louder as a result of applying a louder source file. It's only interested in tone. Okay, so how do we go about the process of applying Match EQ? Well, firstly, we need to set Match EQ up. So where am I actually going to put it? If I want to use a source file, this dance track, which is on this track here, as my source file, to which sound do I want to apply it? Do I want to apply it to just the guitar effects, or just the synths, or just the beats? Or do I want to apply it to the entire mix? Well, to really make the case for Match EQ, I'm going to choose that option. I want to put Match EQ on the output channel where it's going to affect everything that's coming into the mix. So on this output channel, I'm going to put Match EQ right up here at the top. Now, if ever you want to add a plugin above the top row, what you can do is just simply move up to the top and this little white line will appear. And what that allows you to do is to insert a plugin above the top line plugin that's there at the moment. And we're going to come and find Match EQ, which is here, and that will shift everything else down and insert Match EQ in front of it. Okay, so the top section of this plugin looks a lot like an EQ, but we've got these interesting buttons and modes down here, which are obviously different and specific to Match EQ. So what's going to happen is that we're going to have an opportunity to analyze the current frequency content of the existing mix. That is everything apart from the dance track, which we're going to use as our sidechain or as our reference, in fact, audio source. The frequency footprint of that reference track is going to be stored in a different place. So the whole of the current track, it can be analysed and learned here. Then we come to our reference file. That's going to be our dance music track, which we're going to analyse into a different pane within Match EQ. So effectively these two things are going to be separate. And then we have an opportunity to match them. In other words, to apply the EQ curve of the reference file to the current mix. Now, it doesn't actually matter whether or not we learn the current mix first or we analyze the reference file first. We can do either. But as we're here in the current pane, let's do that. So in order for that to happen, what I need to do is just press learn. And then what I'm going to do is to press play. Now, obviously, the way that Match EQ is going to work is that it's going to build up a full sort of understanding of the frequency footprint of this track, the more of it that I play. If I only play one beat, it can only analyze one beat. So I'm going to play this track all the way through so that it gets a chance to have a look at the entire frequency content of this mix. And then I can press stop, and then I can unpress the learn button. And effectively what I have a chance to do then is to see the frequency footprint that's been analysed as a result of this track. So I can see that it's obviously busy in the kind of bass and low mid-range areas, and then we've got these spikes a little bit higher up, but it's by no means a bright, fizzy mix. Okay, let's then move on to the reference tab, where we have an opportunity to analyse the source file that we want to use instead. Now, there are a couple of ways I could do this. So firstly, what I'm obviously going to need to do is to unmute the track which I want to use as a reference file. And in fact, to make sure that all of the current track isn't analysed, I would need to solo it as well, so it's the only thing that's going to play. And of course, I could then press learn, and I could press play all the way through, and we could repeat exactly the process that we've just undertaken. But the other thing that I can do is that I can simply grab this audio file and I can drag it to this reference pane. And by doing that, without having to actually play the track back, what will happen is that Match EQ will have a look at that file and learn its frequency content. And what we then get is a kind of second audio spectrum of this file compared to the current one. Remember, this is the current track that we're interested in, and this is the frequency footprint of the reference track. So having just dragged and dropped it, what I have a chance to do is to obviously visually compare the two. I can see that the reference track is much shinier at the top end. And then what I have a chance to do is to come to this EQ curve, and I can press match. And what will happen is that Logic will then produce the difference effectively so that the frequency content of our reference track can be applied to the current track. Now, we can certainly see that it's going to town with all of the extra frequency content that exists in the reference track, and it'll be very interesting to see how that applies to the source track. So I've now muted our reference track again, and let's listen to the EQ curve applied to our current track from the reference. Okay, so that is a massive change and probably not quite what we had in mind. But you might be thinking, okay, well, that's not going to work and that's not for me. But we're not done really, because what we can now do is to start thinking about exactly how much we want to apply our reference EQ curve to the current track. There are a few things that we can do to make it a little bit less extreme. So firstly, we've got this apply slider on the right-hand side. And at the moment, I can see that 100% of the reference EQ is being applied to the current track. Well, the first thing I can do is to make things a whole lot smoother and much less extreme by bringing the apply sort of percentage down considerably. So here is exactly the same approach, but this time with only 35% of the analysis curve being applied to the reference track. Okay, well that's definitely sounding much, much better, but we've still got this big spike up at the top end. And in fact, actually, I'm kind of missing some of the ways that the frequency content is applied lower down, But by turning this back up, I know that I'm going to encounter this problem up at the top end where everything sounds really overhyped. Now, this is where we have an opportunity to fade the extremes. And this is a really nice additional tool, which allows us to modify how extremely we're applying the analyzed reference file at the low end and at the high end, because inevitably these are likely to be the areas which are most different between the tracks that you might be analyzing and then applying those techniques to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slightly increase the area, the frequency area over which I'm applying this upper sort of extreme change, if you like. So I'm dropping that down to 5K, and as a result, what's happening is that obviously this more extreme band is being much more sort of tamed. What I might do, because I like what's happening at the low end a little bit more, is to back this down to just frequencies, let's say around the sort of 40 hertz mark, rather than sort of opening that up into the low mid-range. And as a result, what we've now got potentially is the opportunity to slightly increase the apply amount. So we're benefiting from some of these other areas without these being quite so extreme. Okay, and we've got a couple of other techniques that we can look at here as well. Firstly, at the moment, we're applying the reference frequency spectrum completely evenly across both channels. This channel link slider is effectively providing us with exactly the same EQ curve across both channels. In other words, it's being applied completely evenly to both left and right. But you can see that what I can do is to decouple those a little bit, which effectively means that we've got a little bit of wriggle room in terms of how the frequency content is applied. If I've got a mix which is different, sort of from a frequency point of view across the stereo mix, in my current track compared to the reference track, delinking the sort of fixed nature of just one set of frequency analysis tools being applied to both sides of the mix might also sound a bit more musical. Okay, that's really nice. It's subtle, but that is making a really interesting difference. And you can see the way that the sort of spectrogram is applied. We can now see that rather than just absolutely one fixed curve applied universally across both sides, what we've now got a chance to do is to sort of slightly decouple those a little bit, which sounds a little bit more musical. And what we can also do is to apply different smoothing amounts. Now, this effectively is going to bring different bands into play. The true sort of matched EQ without any frequency smoothing at all provides a number of additional analyzed bands. If you think about it, it's not a surprise that the difference from a frequency point of view between the reference mix and the current mix is going to be pretty extreme. Every analyzed frequency band where there's a sort of dynamic difference is going to show up. And it's not a surprise that by default, the kind of smoothing amount just ever so slightly notches out some of those individual spikes. And I can go further so that effectively we end up with a much less extreme collection of frequencies, or I can open it up. So again, this is going to be an interesting sort of parameter to play with to see exactly how the benefits lie between the analyzed file and how we choose to apply it. So certainly somewhere in the middle here, we get a sort of more natural sound. But if we want all of this kind of extra detail, particularly in the sort of mid-range, then of course, backing the smoothing amount down will certainly produce a different effect. So what we've got here is a really interesting tool, which we can use in a number of ways. Now, I've deliberately put this on the output channel, so we have an opportunity to see the extreme version of Match EQ. But there are loads of ways that you could use this just in the context of individual tracks. So let's suppose, for instance, and ideally this is a situation you'd want to avoid, but let's suppose you had to record a vocalist with 2 different microphones on 2 different days in 2 different sessions. And what you wanted to do was to take the kind of frequency footprint of the first recording you'd made through microphone A and sort of apply that tonal balance to microphone B. Yes, it won't be a perfect match, but it might just even out the differences in tonal character between those 2 different performances, as one example. Or maybe you want to take the kind of grit of a synth part from another track that you've made where you've got aggression and power and apply it to maybe something that sounds a little bit tamer in your current project. And again, using Match EQ, what you can effectively do is to take the kind of tonal character of that second sound and apply it to the first. So whether you're working with individual sounds or across an entire mix, this is definitely a really interesting technique if you want to produce the kind of tonal character of one sound and apply it to another.